to recording today's session, and we'll make it available to you along with copies of the slides in the next few days. So with that, if we want to just go to the next slide. So some of the interesting things about this industry is watching the evolution and the way in which we see technology moving through and its adaptation in different locations. And so what this slide really talks to you about is where are we today? And what I love is really some of these statistics I think are self-evident of where we've gone in really to the last 2 to 3 years. So today, we have, with 442 commercially launched LTE networks. They're in 147 countries. So that's 755 million LTE connections as of Q2 2015. 755 million connections that are LTE, which is a fantastic stat. So now mobile operators are making the move to advance the VoLTE market with 111 operators investing in VoLTE deployments. So already there are 30 operators in 21 countries that have commercially launched VoLTE-based high-definition voice, HD voice, and the GSA announced that, last month that 246 VoLTE-capable devices, including 224 smartphones, have been announced, which puts us in a position to where there's just simply a greater density and availability of both having the networks ready, the devices ready, and ultimately we're just going to see these numbers increase. So I think this view geographically of where we are today is a great way to think about the evolution. So we're starting in the dark blue and sort of moving gradually into the green towards VoLTE. But as you can see on this next slide, when we think about the VoLTE market forecast, 83% of carriers surveyed by Interconnect say they will deploy VoLTE by 2016, and that 600 million smartphone users worldwide will use VoLTE by 2018 as their default voice service. So let's put that in context, right? So there's roughly 6 billion devices or so out there today. So we're still talking a very relatively small number proportionally, but this is obviously growing. And so the latest reports from High Telecom tell us that VoLTE roaming minutes of use will grow by a CAGR of 145% over the next 5 years to reach 4.7 billion by 2020. So we've got the deployments of VoLTE, and then the drive more towards VoLTE roaming, which of course is one of the topics we're going to get here too. So there's clearly market demand, and that's what we're going to cover. What's driving the move to VoLTE, and look at some of the best practices and what are the lessons learned you should be bearing in mind as you plan your implementation. So today, with the help of our very, very experienced guest speakers, we're going to address that question and share some of the best practices that we've learned in helping manage some of the first implementations of VoLTE roaming, including we're so thrilled to be able to have the first transoceanic VoLTE roaming call for U.S. and Japanese operators in March. We also did the world's first commercial VoLTE roaming service in April, giving subscribers of South Korea's LG Plus and the ability to roam into KDDI network in Japan. And in September, LG Plus extended its commercial VoLTE roaming for subscribers to the SmartTone network in Hong Kong, again using the Syniverse IPX network. And so we wanted to, before we get started though, it's always so easy on some of these conversations to not really take advantage of the fact that we've got some of you folks on the call right now that are contemplating your next move. So we're going to do something a little different here. We're going to ask you a question. There's a poll, and you're going to see a little pop-up screen to your right. And the first poll question, we're going to ask you a couple. We're going to ask you. And your responses are completely confidential, and we're not going to be sharing any company names in this response. We just want to get a feel for where our audience is in this thinking. We're going to give you 30 seconds to provide your response. And so the question we want you to consider is, if you are planning to launch VoLTE in your home network, what is your timeline? Is it already launched, next 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 12 months, or beyond, or undecided? So we're going to give you a few minutes to do that. And then all of a sudden, it's going to just give me the answer, which is so exciting. I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds, and we'll hopefully have this pop up to me so that I can see what the results are. or perhaps it might actually be make the most sense. My colleague John Walker may also be providing that data as we're sitting here, because I'm now very interested in knowing this answer. And I think some of you may be anticipating what our next question might be, because of course there's a little bit of a test here, which is your home network and what is your timeline. So I guess we will see how these responses go. I think the key thing is certainly there is such a density of the dark blue that we've got that we'll see. Okay, so all right, so we have a lot of reticent responders today. What we've got is, so it looks like 14% of you have said that you've already launched. 9% of you say it's going to be within the next 6 months. 13% of you say it's going to be within the next 6 to 12 months. 10% say it's going to be 12 months or beyond. And then there's a huge group of you that just are not telling us anything, which is, you know, it's undecided and no answers, somewhere in that sort of over 50%. But that's okay. You know, these are the things we're learning and hopefully finding out. So it does seem, though, that, you know, 6 to 12 months or 12 months or longer is where the majority of you are leaning towards as you think forward. So what's the next question? I kind of gave you a little bit of an idea of what that question is, and we'll bring that up here if you want to go to the next slide. If you're planning to launch VoLTE roaming, what is your timeline? Haven't launched yet. You know, they haven't launched the home network yet, right? So that's key. So next 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 12 months or beyond, undecided. And I think, you know, this is one of those things as you're responding, keep in mind, we feel very strongly that, and know very well over the many years, I can go back to, you know, the launch of CDPD all the way back, you know, to you know, the old days, if you will. And you go back 10 years ago and the launch really of 3G. The transition from the focus on the home to implementing roaming is always sequential, and the home is always the focus. That's very logical as would naturally be considered. But I think when we consider VoLTE and the demand that we have for the entire team to, you know, when you consider the way in which the individuals as ourselves as consumers, we are so desperate to understand exactly what our quality is going to be. Quality is so very much the focus. I think one of those things is that, you know, once you get HD voice, it's hard to go back. And I think it's just like anything else. Once you have fast download speeds, you immediately always want to assume that they're going to be present. So how did it turn out for roaming? So 4% of you said that you haven't launched home network yet. 9% have said it'll be in the next 6 months. 13 and 11% respectively said either 6 to 12 months or 12 months and beyond. So really a great proportion of you are saying that it is going to be within the next 12 months of the respondents, and 5% said that they were undecided. But that's great to see. It's an interesting reflection of the intent that you have. And a lot of this is about that. You know, a lot of this is understanding what is the intention that you're planning, what are you trying to accommodate for your consumers, and how are you trying to remain as relevant as possible. So, okay, then let me get to who you're going to hear from today, because I think you'll be really thrilled with some of these participants. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and let me introduce our experts today. We're really pleased to have Keith Dyer join us today. He founded the Mobile Network in 2013, introducing a new voice to the media that's covering mobile network technology. He's got over 17 years experience covering the mobile network ecosystem as both a journalist and an editor, and through a variety of channels, you know, that helps the mobile network specialize in understanding and making sense of the technology that helps operators design and plan, optimize, and monetize their mobile network. So Keith has tracked the development of the VoLTE ecosystem since its beginnings, covering technology development in the core and IMS, and the associated challenges with service assurance and management in service launches and operator deployments. So we're really thrilled to have Keith's input today. And John Wick is responsible for the management and growth of the Syniverse IP, SS7, and number portability product lines. And John's been with Syniverse since '93 and is a critical analyst within the network operations department. He's, not only runs the business, he knows as much about it as many of his technologists on his staff. He's held this management position for such a long time. John's a wonderful part of our team. Prior to joining Syniverse, John was a systems integrator with Verizon. It goes all the way back to his wonderful experience in the Air Force, which is where I'm assuming he got his interest in communications. But you'll never know. And John, I think, is going to provide such a great component here of our discussion on what are lessons learned we've heard directly from our customers as we talk about and plan for VoLTE roaming. And so I think we'll be really, I think that'll be some good content here. So no more of me. I'm going to hand it over to Keith, and I'll be back towards the end here to facilitate the question and answer session, and we'll go from there. Keith, I hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Mary. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for joining us, and especially thanks to those who were able to vote on that poll, which has been quite interesting, and I might come back to a little bit later. So I'd like to start with, the traditional but still sincere thanks to Syniverse for inviting me on this event today and giving me really a platform to share some of the conversations that I have been having about VoLTE, voice over LTE deployments over the past 18 months to 2 years. A little bit about the mobile network here. This is what we do, really. We try and make sense of the world's mobile networks, and we produce that in a variety of outputs in magazines, online, in special reports, and in papers. And that means, really, that we spend quite a bit of time trying to understand where the technology is headed, what operators are thinking about in terms of implementation. And I have to say that, over those 2-3 years, VoLTE has really been one of the dominant topics there. And I think that's because it touches on so many critical elements for operators. It's certainly been about technical transformation for sure, but also it's a core service for them. It touches really directly on customer experience. This is voice. Operators just cannot afford to break voice. It's their core service. And with voice over LTE, it's actually even more important than that. It's their, it's the high value customers, isn't it? It's the customers generally with the best phones with the LTE tariffs. And so voice over LTE has been a challenge for them, not to break something that's so critical. So next slide. If we look at this, what I'm hoping to do then is to move on to give a view of how operators are thinking about first VoLTE and then move that on to VoLTE roaming, based on those conversations that I've been having. And the first thing to say is this: I certainly agree with the thrust of Mary's slide. We're only going to see more of voice over LTE. There's clear commitments there. So operators are fully committed. But, it's not always been an easy road for operators to travel. And I think to understand VoLTE roaming, perhaps we need to start with the experiences of VoLTE itself. I'll explain why a little bit later, but it's a bit like, to understand the future, we must first understand the past. And so I just have a little recap of where we've got to here on the next slide. And this is really acknowledging that it's not always been easy for operators to get to this point. Now, as an example here, this quote at the top actually is from a pretty well-known, it's a tier 1 operator. It's not Verizon, by the way, but it is an operator with several million LTE subscribers. So, admittedly, they had to do more than perhaps spin up a cloud-based app server and press go for a few customers. I mean, this was a full-service IMS implementation, what they termed as 17 new systems, 74 new interfaces. And I might add in that this company was also actually active in writing the specs. So, they weren't innocents at all. But here you are, the most complex thing I've ever worked on in years. And if you just move on the next button, we'll see some of the issues that operators had to grapple with. So one of the things that it's done, it's really kind of shone a light on across their network and their systems. So I've mentioned here, for instance, it's actually exposed that the radio network is really crucial, and optimizing that has been about limiting the handovers and fallbacks between 3G and 4G, keeping users in good coverage, and that then has a knock-on effect on how you do your signaling. And that in turn has really required operators to get a new look at their network. They need to be able to look at the core, sure, how the IMS elements are working, but also correlate that with what's going on in the radio network. And finally, the final piece of that is understand who the customers are that have been affected, because as I said, these are high-value customers. So that's required some sort of extensive and complex testing. They've needed to perhaps look at different call quality KQIs, new scoring metrics around voice quality. I've mentioned the fact that, you know, that's required intensive efforts in IMS implementation, really because when VoLTE was being spec'd, I think there was an assumption IMS would be there, and actually it's kind of been the other way around. Some of the VoLTE guys have had to be the pathfinders on IMS because it's really made the financial case for that investment, rather than, you know, just riding on top of something that's been existing there. With this being, you know, obviously an all-IP technology, the billing's different. You're not charging per minute, or rather you are charging per minute to the customer, but you're doing something different with the mediation in your back-end systems because it isn't minutes, right? So that you're having to do some billing integration. Devices have been an issue, obviously, in terms of, you know, availability. Is there chip support for SRVCC if operators been that advanced? And a decision around, say, if they're going to use this to also deploy voice over Wi-Fi, is that going to be done natively or as an add-on app? And then this aspect at the end of actually educating the consumer about what you're doing. I mean, so this insert here, that picture of Verizon, I don't know if you guys will remember, but, you know, at the launch to business and enterprise users, they actually sent this flyer out saying to people, you probably can't read it, but it's essentially saying to them, you know, this might not work so well. It's kind of in beta, and it actually tells people how to turn off VoLTE. So I just wanted to touch on those just to give us an idea of some of the challenges operators have faced with the core VoLTE system. But if we move on, we'll see that it's worth it. It's definitely worth it. Here are some of the things that we see as customer benefits. These turn up again and again. I doubt these will surprise the more knowledgeable people amongst you here. But just to back this up, you'll see that some of these are also backed up by the SK Telecom survey, which was done very recently into their own customers. You know, what do you see as the benefits? The big one here is obviously call quality. Now, let's be honest, you don't have to do voice over LTE to get HD voice, but this is the key differentiator that most operators have gone to market with, and it is the one that consumers also like. So let's attach some value to that. Setup time, you're probably aware of this as well, how quick it is. In fact, you've probably heard the tales that it can be too quick. Customers can get a bit spooked. They place a call and they don't get that sort of 3 to 4 seconds thinking time you're used to. You know, it's instant. So, you know, in future, you know, be ready to speak before dialing. And then the last one here is really service richness, which, you know, at the moment is probably about, you know, voice video switching in call, being able to set up a video call very quickly and easily. But, you know, clearly that is the visible benefit to customers at the moment in terms of service richness. But if we move on, we'll see that, you know, the benefits of VoLTE are not just about, you know, the customer benefits. We're seeing that for their operators themselves, it's really giving them sort of some back-end benefits to their operational activities for the carriers. You know, we often see things on this list that get mentioned. I particularly pick out a couple here. One would be the voice over Wi-Fi element here, because you're able to support that extension into areas of perhaps poor coverage or indoors, but with the same core control, and that's really important. And if you're going with an on-device client, not an app, then with the same dialer, the same voice app. So that's been important. Obviously, we're also looking at some longer-term benefits in time, either refarming or turning off either 2G or 3G spectrum, depending on the market. And I'll mention a couple of other, perhaps more hidden benefits. One would be that you're getting more efficient use of your existing spectrum. So if these are, you know, better smartphones that operators are finding are actually better tuned to LTE bands, so I've heard. That means that you are then not wanting that customer with his LTE phone to have to be using your 2G network to make his voice calls, because if he does, he actually requires a better signal to noise ratio on the 2G network than somebody with a dumb feature phone. So what are you doing? You're then having to invest in a 2G network to support your high-end LTE user. It doesn't make sense. So, you know, getting LTE rolled out and then getting customers onto voice over LTE, that's a big plus in terms of signaling and spectral efficiency for operators. So given those benefits for customers and for operators, we might therefore ask the question, which we'll come on to on the next slide, you know, if VoLTE is hard but ultimately beneficial, you know, does the same hold for VoLTE roaming? You know, and we've seen from Mary, there's been a great run of LTE launches, and then that tends to get followed up by voice over LTE. We might then see some national interconnect within the countries, and then of course you'd expect just to see a natural move to voice over LTE roaming from country to country. And yet, you know, we haven't necessarily seen that trajectory. I think we saw there, you know, 30 launches, 20 countries. We've really got two to three countries connected so far. And I think you have to ask yourself at this point, why? Why is that? I don't think it's to do with a lack of will. If you look at this insert here from some work that Ovum have done, actually it sort of roughly mirrors the poll that we just carried out here. You know, there's a decent chunk of people who think that they will be deploying roaming within somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. You know, you've got sort of 80% of people by 2 years think that they'll have roaming done from VoLTE launch. So I don't think it's about will. So maybe we need to look for some other questions. So if we look onto the next slide, we'll maybe see that, you know, is it actually about realizing the benefits here? I mean, let's just ask here, why enable VoLTE roaming in the first place? What are the benefits? What does it matter if your customer goes abroad and falls back to 2G or 3G voice and, you know, it works? Are there actually any benefits for you in investing in not having that? And I think, you know, the operators I've spoken to, they feel uncomfortable with not being able to offer a service, you know, like home when customers roam, you know, especially as these are their high value customers. You know, so I want to reiterate here that operators do want to launch, and some of these reasons are worth stating why. You know, obviously when your customer goes abroad, they want to make a call. They'll find a way to make it. If you don't offer them the best way, they might get on some Wi-Fi, make a Skype call. And then you've lost them really, haven't you, in terms of managing the quality, especially if this is somebody on a business tariff or, you know, who's not so concerned about perhaps the expense of it. And you want to keep this guy, your customers happy there. And then the other sort of longer term thing here that's going on, of course, is that if you're on a visited network where there's no 2G or 3G or your own network, you've turned it off, you know, you're really looking at voice over LTE roaming as the long-term guarantor of interoperability. So I think, you know, if you look at this list here, these are the benefits for why operators would like to enable it. But if we move on, we'll see that actually perhaps there are one or two hurdles to doing that. And I think that some of the concerns here are technical. I think this is why I mentioned the work that has gone on so far in the home network, if you like, just to enable VoLTE, because, you know, this has happened, and then to turn around and say, okay, we now need to do another difficult technical integration to enable roaming. You know, that's going to cause some dismay within operators, and has done so. You know, we've invested in the IMS. You're telling me I need to go again with something, and so this is what happened on the technical side. We've seen these basically the two camps, if you like. One with Ravel, which is a local breakout option. Now, I'm not going to get too deeply into these because it really forms the core of a lot of what John is going to talk about. But essentially, the first option was looked at having a local breakout where some signaling went home to the home network first, and then if the call needed to be broken out locally, that signaling would go back to a new function in the visited network, and you'd have this IMS to IMS connection. And really, that was kind of challenging. And so then there was a view that maybe we can just sort of piggyback on a little bit the existing LTE data roaming structure. So this S8 home routing, the HR is for home routing. The S8 stands for the interface between the visited and the home network, and really you're tunneling both the media and SIP signaling from the visited network back to the home network. So it's simpler perhaps, but there are some issues in terms of feature support. There's no SRVCC support, which is the method really of keeping the call connected when it hands over from an LTE to a 3G network. So if your outbound roamer starts a voice over LTE call and then moves out of LTE coverage, does he lose the call? There's no emergency number support, and legal intercept's a problem for some jurisdictions as well. And just at the bottom there, I would add that on top of the sort of technical hurdles, we are seeing perhaps, some challenges around people looking at, forming roaming packs again, which is obviously very relevant to the discussion here with Syniverse. So I would say that my informal and anecdotal research has shown that operators yet to launch VoLTE, they're currently all out to get it done. Now, I'm aware this is a US-based webinar in terms of time zones, and so you're probably thinking, right, well, we've had this for a while here, but, I can guarantee you that, in the rest of the world, this stuff is still taxing people. So they're all out to get this done technically, and then when they launch, the emphasis is really on the optimization and the insurance, as I said. And they see VoLTE roaming as a little bit down the path. They expect it will happen. They're aware that there are standards discussions going on, I've mentioned, and they're looking at leadership adoption. But, put simply, VoLTE roaming is not yet, and I emphasize the yet, a priority for those in the midst of the rollouts, but it quickly becomes one afterwards. We've seen on the poll here today, and also those over numbers, we've seen that 6 to 12 month launch as an expectation. So that is why the people in the core teams are not keen to see this require more technical optimization. They do want to go. So I think with reference to John's section of this webinar, just to recap, to lead into that, we've seen that operators are definitely committed to voice over LTE, but it's not been easy. And that deployment has sucked up some resources and some of their thinking space. And so we've maybe not seen so much public talking from the operators about VoLTE roaming, but it's certainly happening in the industry with the vendors, with the Interconnect and IPX providers. And they're very switched on to what have been the technical discussions and also on the business implications of those decisions. But I think these questions still remain, which is, are the proposed architectures technically efficient, and how should we do it? And the second one is, when do we go? Is it worth it to go early, or do we wait to deploy? And I think these are still live questions. And so with that, I think it's a good point to hand back to Mary, who will lead us into the next phase of the webinar. And I thank you for your time.
Keith, thanks so much for that. I really appreciate that insight. You've raised, I think, the really pertinent questions that are very top of mind. And I think what we'll get now in John's section is sort of what have we been hearing as we talk to customers about answering those questions. So I'll hand it over to John, and where are those learnings that we've got? So go ahead, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Keith. Thank you to everybody that's participating or dialed in today. Thank you for making time to let us talk to you about this exciting area in the business. As Keith has said, there's been a lot of time spent over the past 2 or 3 years talking about LTE and VoLTE, and it's to the point now where it's happening in a real way on several continents and keeping companies like ours very busy. But again, thanks for participating today and giving us some of your time. So before we launch into a discussion about VoLTE roaming, I thought it might be helpful to briefly clarify the difference between VoLTE Interconnect and VoLTE roaming. So with VoLTE Interconnect, you may have already been exposed to it or are thinking about it, but if you look at the diagram, you've got mobile operator A on the left and mobile operator B on the right, and 2 subscribers, one tended to each operator. With VoLTE Interconnect, when these 2 subscribers place a phone call to each other using VoLTE, that phone call is serviced directly over the IPX between those 2 operators' networks. And that might be a phone call, it might be a video session, it might be a media session. But the key point is that today in a non-VoLTE environment, that same phone call goes over what we all know as the international long-distance network. It might pass through 3, 4, 5 or more carrier networks to facilitate the connection between these 2 subscribers. So a lot of quality of experience and things like that are possible when you look at how a person-to-person VoLTE call or VoLTE Interconnect can be handled directly over one network between 2 wireless networks. And on the bottom, of the chart, we've got VoLTE roaming, which is what we're going to talk about today. And this is, as you all know, when a subscriber from a home network, in this case, mobile network operator A, travels to mobile network operator B and expects to be able to use all the services that they enjoy while they're at home, voice, data, messaging, all of those things that, that we love to use with our phones. So with that, let's move on to the next chart and take a closer look at the models that are used for VoLTE roaming. So Keith mentioned the S8 home routing model, and that's what we're going to talk about first. And the diagram that you're looking at shows on the left side the serving network, or a network that is roamed into, and on the right side you've got a home network, which is the subscriber's home network, and they travel to the network on the left. So with S8 home routing, the VoLTE calls are served by the visited network provider as an LTE data roaming session, just like how the internet traffic is supported, by leveraging the visited networks provider's evolved packet core network. The interface designation between the serve and the home is called S8, hence the terminology S8 home routing. VoLTE roaming via S8 home routing is quickly gaining momentum with a 5-to-1 ratio in favor of S8 home routing. And by the time we get through this webinar, hopefully you'll have a good appreciation why that ratio is where it's at. So if you think about the advantages and the challenges with S8 home routing, so from an advantage perspective, it uses the same GTP tunnel as LTE data roaming traffic. Therefore, it's faster to deploy than local breakout, and we'll explain why as we get through some more of the slides. However, due to the complexities that come with VoLTE, it's not as fast to deploy as circuit switch voice or 3G and LTE data. It uses the same components that are already in the evolved packet core network, or the EPC. This is because IMS is not used in the visitor operator's network. Also, since most calls typically will go back to the home country, the home operator can leverage their existing voice infrastructure and operator interconnections to complete calls in a reliable and cost-effective manner. So to summarize, when you use S8 home routing as a roamer, and you make phone calls, use data, all of these things, it's all being enabled and facilitated by the same network that you used when you were at home. The serving network effectively is using the same data or bearer channel that you would use just to do LTE data roaming to enable the services that come with VoLTE. So now let's flip to some of the challenges. Oh, no, go back to the previous chart. So I'm being told to talk a little bit louder, so hopefully you guys can hear me. So on the challenge side, lawful intercept and emergency calling have to be worked out with S8 home routing. With lawful intercept, the home network is able to access the data, but the visited network cannot. Because the traffic is routed back to the home, emergency calling does not route locally. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. If you dial 911 and you're in the served network, they're not routing that call. Those digits that you just dialed are being passed to your home network, and the home network is responsible to figure out what it is you're trying to call, and depending on the geography of where you're at, 911 may or may not make sense. There's no SRVCC, so this means that if you're on an LTE or a VoLTE session and you're moving, and you move off of the VoLTE IMS network onto the 3G network, there may be issues, there will very likely be issues with call handoff. That's what the reference to SRVCC is all about. There's no service visibility for the serving network. So as you can see, all things that you do with the device are effectively tunneled to the home network. The home network sees what you're trying to do and is responsible for making sure that it works. The served network is simply providing a path for the data packets to get to the home network. SMS is not distinguishable from signaling. And then the home operator cannot retail bill based on the TAP record because it appears in TAP based on the data megabytes. IMS records within the home network must be used to determine the call information needed to retail bill by minutes of use. The home operator must use the charging ID if they want to correlate their retail charges from the IMS records or their wholesale charges from TAP. So as you can see, it's leveraging the same LTE data roaming facility that already is in place to make VoLTE work. Hence, it's easier to deploy and get working immediately. However, there are some drawbacks and challenges which we've covered. The next method to do VoLTE roaming is referred to as local breakout. So if we go to the next slide. Now, the picture has changed a little bit, as you can see, so let me spend a few minutes describing what we're looking at. So on the left, you've got the serving network again, or the VPMN. And on the right, you've got the home network. And now you've got two IMS core networks working together to facilitate the VoLTE roaming session. So in the previous chart, the VoLTE IMS capabilities were all being provided by the home network. With this model, which is called local breakout, the serving network and the home network work together to make the session work. So what are the advantages and the disadvantages? So because the home and the visited network are using IMS, there's now more visibility into both the control plane and the media plane. Aspects of a call or a video session are now visible, and both networks can see what's happening. Local breakout provides the full ability to offer lawful intercept and emergency call handling. Because the local network is now handling the digits dialed and processing that call, they know exactly what it is you're trying to do and can make that work. SRVCC, which as you recall from the previous chart, is the handoff from the IMS network to the 3G network, is now possible. There's continuity, which means that there's continuity of a voice call when you're moving between LTE and circuit switched, which is a pretty big deal. And because the visited network has visibility of the call information using their IMS records, TAP records can be created to reflect minutes of use. This makes it possible to now use TAP to enable retail billing. Let's talk about the challenges. Oh, did you? Yep, good. So while it's much more, oh, back one. Okay, perfect. Thanks, we're good. So while it's much more powerful and flexible, local breakout brings more complexity to implementing and supporting VoLTE roaming. So you've now got two core networks that have to work together, and there are complications and interworking and interoperability situations that will arise. And you'll notice that the drawing now has a little blue box in the middle that's called an IMS exchange. This box is there specifically to address these interworking and interoperability complexities that will arise when local breakout is being used and the two networks have to work together simultaneously to make the different sessions work. Now, as operators begin to implement the IMS cores within their networks, variations on implementation and configuration will occur. And again, this is going to drive more interoperability issues that must be resolved. Hence, the reasons why we view the local breakout model as being more complex than the S8 home routing. There are multiple feeds required from many network elements for both the visited and the home network, up to 25 in some cases. For billing, there isn't just one CDR to obtain the needed information as there is in 3G. They need to get the information from the multiple network elements and correlate in order to create one TAP record. Likewise, the home network cannot just use one CDR. They also have to get information required for retail billing from multiple network elements and consolidate that into one record. Now, there is a hybrid approach here where operators may choose to implement home routing for data and local breakout for voice. More complexity to implement and to operate. And then finally, I'll reference that the TAP record was updated to support VoLTE in 2012 with version 3.12. And this version added to the TAP records two new fields including what's called the mobile session record and the messaging event record for messaging. So these new record types will need to be supported by both roaming partners in order to be able to use TAP to facilitate the wholesale and retail billing. Now, let's move on to the next chart and talk about some of the lessons learned. So Mary mentioned in the beginning some of the things that we've accomplished in working with the carriers around the world. So the first transoceanic VoLTE roaming session, through collaboration with an American and Japanese operator, we enabled the first transoceanic VoLTE roaming call, and we were using the S8 home routing architecture at that time. We also established VoLTE roaming between South Korea and Japan. And as you can see, LGU Plus subscribers from Korea roaming onto KDDI network in Japan, and we worked with both carriers to make that possible. And then finally, the launch of the world's first commercial VoLTE roaming service, and again involving LGU Plus, great partner of ours, subscribers from Korea roaming into the smartphone network in Hong Kong to use VoLTE roaming as well. So as you can see, we've been actively involved working with mobile operators to trial and commercially launch VoLTE roaming, and we're very excited about what's to come with more VoLTE roaming and VoLTE Interconnect as well. Now let's move on to the next chart and get into some more details about lessons learned across different models. So if you think about the S8 home routing model, which we've done quite a bit of, and you recall that there's a 5-to-1 ratio of favorability to using this model versus local breakout. So during the transoceanic call trial, we were pleasantly surprised to learn that despite slight connection delays and latency introduced from S8 home routing, the latency, call setup, and call quality were all better than the current 3G methods that were available. Well, a real-time control of voice traffic eliminates the need for CAMEL, as many services that require CAMEL can be provided natively by the home operator's IMS core network. So eliminating the need for CAMEL and putting the control in the home carrier's network is a big advantage. When you think about how voice calls work today when you roam, they are facilitated by the serving network. In this model, if the subscriber is sent to the home network, and whatever the capabilities are in the home network are also available when they roam. We also found out that handsets do not default to VoLTE for roaming. So you need to work with your handset vendors to modify those defaults and make sure that you've got that taken care of. Just one of those things that we encountered as we've gone through testing and commercial launches that people need to know that they may not think of. Assume that the home operator would support lawful intercept. So this is not a safe assumption. It's something that definitely needs to be discussed in advance. There are different cases based on regulatory situations geographically within countries that just simply need to be discussed up front so that there aren't any surprises as you get down the path of testing with anticipation of doing a commercial launch either immediately or shortly after testing is concluded. And then finally, the charging for VoLTE needs to be worked out by each operator. Today, many operators are charging LTE data IoT rates for VoLTE. If it's decided to charge differently for VoLTE, the visited operator must distinguish the VoLTE records from the data records using QCI and APNs. So quality connection indicators and access point names, technical talk, but I'm sure a substantial number of the people on the call know what those are, and they're very important when you move into VoLTE and S8 home routing. Now, let's talk about more lessons learned. If we go to the next chart. Again, with sticking with S8 home routing, so operators must understand how their roaming partner supports S8 home routing. So we talked about the quality connection indicators a second ago. The deployment of QCI on one side might be different than the deployment of QCI on the serving side. That needs to be synchronized, either between the home and the served network, or in some cases, the IPX provider in the middle can provide solutions to make that work as well. What's the maximum bit rate for each quality connection indicator? What are the number of APNs and which APNs are going to be supported for the quality connection indicator? Now, with video calls started during voice calls, it can be difficult to distinguish by the serving network. It appears as another data flow, so two separate tap records are created. The home network needs to consider correlation of records for retail billing, so you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you're chasing down multiple records that were generated for the same session without an awareness of the association between those records when the user ends whatever they're doing and you need to correlate and generate a wholesale CDR. SMS is viewed as signaling. So the visited operator will not be able to distinguish SMS from voice signaling. And since operators don't usually charge for signaling, they will not charge for SMS. So this is certainly something that needs to be looked at and thought about. If operators start charging for SMS, it could lead to spam. So anything that is free, as we all know, usually ends up getting exploited, and there's no exception here. In today's SS7 and diameter signaling networks, the operators don't charge for signaling because it's assumed to be equal on both sides. The GSMA is recommending that operators may want to consider charging for signaling to avoid the spam issues. So one way to control this and make sure that things are happening appropriate is to apply some form of a commercial model to it. We'll see how that works out over time. So that concludes the lessons learned, and at that point, I think I'll turn it over to Mary, and we'll do some Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. I think it's always a little intimidating, I think, sometimes when you see these diagrams on these slides, but yet the reality is that it's so similar. If you've been doing 3G related roaming, now I'm just seeing how does this play into to VoLTE roaming and LTE. These are all terms that we all know, and that for the most part, it's just simply figuring out these additional challenges. How do you manage these lessons? And so there's just a wealth of information that was in that section of John's presentation that I think may have been pretty dense, but I think we've got a lot there that we can that you can learn from, and there's a great deal of depth. So I think the fact that we're recording this is great. It could be something that you want to go back to. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and so I'm going to take these, and what I'd like to do is ask Keith and John to respond, and I'll pick which one of you goes first to respond first, and we'll go round robin like that. So the first question that's come in is, what about Latin America, and what is the timeline to implement VoLTE roaming? Maybe Keith, if you could respond from what you're hearing at a macro level, and John, maybe some of your insight from what we're hearing from some of our customers might be helpful. So Keith, you want to start that one off first?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't heard that Latin America presents any specific, different challenges to implementing VoLTE roaming than elsewhere. So if we're saying from launch to roaming, I wouldn't say there'd be any particular differences there. And obviously you're looking at some fairly major group operators down there with Telefonica and the likes. So, I wouldn't have any specific information to say it'd be any different from other markets. I don't know about you, John.
No, I think from a practical application perspective, certainly that region of the world is no different than others. From a timeline perspective, I think if you think about Mexico and as being part of that Latin America segment, certainly there's some activity coming from that part of the world right now. Clearly, LTE roaming for data has been in place for a while with those networks, and they're starting to progress towards doing some of the testing around VoLTE roaming, and to that extent, VoLTE Interconnect as well. Further south from Mexico, I think a little more time. LTE data roaming is beginning to pick up in those parts of the world, and VoLTE is I don't know if I would handicap it to second half of 16, first half of 17, but certainly out there in terms of timing. But from a practical application perspective, certainly no barriers that we've encountered that we think are going to be problematic to limit moving forward with these things.
So it's really just more of an issue of where's the market demand that's driving it, not so much of a technical issue. It's more of a business decision, it sounds like, perhaps it hasn't, because I think what I'm perceiving is that there's a little bit of a delay that's being perceived, a lag that may or may not really be occurring in reality, but I think that's a little bit of what's being inferred here. So I think that's critical. So another question has come in, and we'll go in reverse order here. John, I'll ask you to respond first, and then Keith, if you want to chime in. So this particular question is, charging for VoLTE is a challenge. Has any operator implemented VoLTE charging through Syniverse? I thought these would be bill and pay, except using deep packet inspection for video. So I think, let me just read that one more time. Charging for VoLTE is a challenge. Has any operator implemented VoLTE charging through Syniverse? I thought these would be bill and pay, except using deep packet inspection for video. So I think, John, you maybe take the first part of that and talk about what we're hearing about VoLTE and VoLTE charging.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually a great question, and it hits right on the head of where this will evolve to. So, you know, has anybody, you know, looked upon us to help them with VoLTE charging? I would answer that as yes from a wholesale perspective, and I would put it right into the same category as the way that we facilitate and support the wholesale roaming model for 3G. Now, what the question hits on, though, is being able to do service-aware charging, which now gets you into either, you know, doing DPI or you know, analyzing the QCI and the APN to determine exactly what service is being used and what is the rate to be charged for that service. I would love to be able to say that, yes, we are doing that right now, but we don't have anybody that has needed that yet. We certainly expect that to happen at some point in the future, but right now we have not gone there yet. So as it stands today, the typical wholesale, you know, clearing model that we know very well is what we've seen applied here.
Keith,
yeah,
any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I would not really have much to add to that. I'm afraid I'm not a billing and charging expert, but I know that, you know, that the main issues John has touched on have certainly been current in the market. But in terms of, you know, DPI for video, obviously there's going to need to be some service awareness, and that, I think, is, you know, if I can say this, probably easier for me to say it than John, that's certainly part of the functionality that, you know, the IPX can provide to this market.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, there are things that we just simply haven't been able to do before that we can. It's just going to be interesting to see, certainly on the wholesale level, how these services get implemented and what's that business model going to be, and the charging principles. I still think, you know, we are very early stages with this. I think what I'm anticipating is, frankly, not in the next 2 years. I think we're going to be dealing with just straight voice, and the real issue is, you know, are you doing home routing? Are you doing local breakout? Mm-hmm. Those are going to be the drivers, I think, for the charging issue. But I could talk about charging for a long time, so I'm going to stop. Let me go to the next one. And this actually works out well. Keith, I think you can go first on this one. This question is really very top of mind for us at Syniverse on a regular basis. The roaming model is changing in Europe due to regulatory changes. A total true statement. Do you think that affects the VoLTE roaming migration, is the question. The roaming model is changing in Europe due to regulatory changes. Do you think that affects the VoLTE roaming migration? Keith, would love your point of view.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm trying to get my head around. So obviously what we're talking about in Europe is the fact that there will be no premium for roaming within the EU countries over the tariff you pay at home. So in terms of, you know, the billing and charging, obviously operators have to find a way of enabling that. So within that, you know, VoLTE roaming will fall within that, obviously, within the data usage that users have. There are one or two proposed structural elements that may come in roaming. I'm not sure if they go anywhere, and this is the idea of having the the alternative roaming provider who. So just to explain this a little bit, so if you're you have your home contract like you'd normally have with your service provider, you might be allowed to go and buy another contract to provide you with roaming prices. This was really brought in to try and bring about price decreases, but now the EU have basically mandated that anyway in law. I don't think we'll see the alternative roaming provider apart from one or two maybe specific cases. So structurally, I think we're still looking at the exchange model that we're used to, but obviously voice will have to fall within the price limits that have been imposed on operators.
Totally agree with that. John, any thoughts on, is this affecting rollout? I think was kind of the intent behind this call. Go ahead for this question. No, but I mean, you're right on. I mean, that was really helpful, Keith, because it gave the background. I mean, I think it's really, are we seeing an impact on rollout? Go ahead, John.
Sure. No, thanks. Keith explained it pretty well. I guess I would characterize it this way: if you're looking at a carrier or set of carriers that are committed, they've made the investment, they've got the handsets on the way, either already or on the way. I don't think that this is a strong enough component to hold up the migration or rollout. And as Keith said in his opening segment, the quality of experience is substantially beyond what we see and get today with 3G, and it's one thing to hear it, but once you experience it, once you experience some of these services, it's quite impressive how much advanced they are compared to 3G. So I don't think these regulatory movements are going to have a visible impact on the momentum.
I think the only thing I would add, or add as a caveat, is that I think actually it could speed things up. Because what's being taken off the table in Europe is the opportunity to use price as a competitive, compelling argument to have a consumer change from one home operator to another due to roaming pricing, right? Today, we did some research back in February of last year where we polled consumers in the US, UK, and Germany saying, would you leave your home operator if you had the ability to have greater than 50% decrease in your roaming fees, or free, no roaming fees? Would you change your home operator? And there was $16 billion in revenue that we estimated that could be lost because of the overwhelming response of yes. And I think what could very well occur here is a circumstance where we have operators that are number 2, number 3 in the market that are looking to attract subscribers that make a decision to speed up their implementation of VoLTE roaming simply to look and try to find that compelling reason that helps make the consumer make a different argument. Because with roaming pricing coming off of the table, it's going to be an interesting marketplace for competition. So that's the only thing I might speculate, but it's going to be really interesting to see. So with that, we are right at the top of the hour, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, John. Your insights are just incredibly valuable. We thank all of you that have attended this webinar for taking the time. We hope very much that this was valuable and that you picked up some information that you did not previously know of, or have, perhaps lead you to ask additional questions and learn more. We will be sending out a link early next week to you, to the recording as well as to the slides that will be on SlideShare. So we once again appreciate your attendance. Thank you so very much. This is Mary Clark from Syniverse signing off, and we look forward to hosting you again in a future webinar. Thank you.